Dr. Jin-Ho Park stared at his phone in disbelief. The NASA caller ID was still flashing on the screen. He looked out of his office window at the Seoul skyline, trying to process what he had just heard. They wanted him, a helicopter engineer from South Korea, to help build the first aircraft that would fly on Mars. His office at the Korean Space Research Institute felt smaller than usual today. The walls were covered with certificates and awards, but none of them seemed as important as this phone call. Jin-Ho picked up the small model helicopter on his desk, one he had built during his college days. It was a simple design that had won him first place in a national competition. Dr. Park, his assistant, Young Mei, knocked on the door. "Your 2 o'clock meeting is waiting." "Cancel it," Jin-Ho said, still looking at the model in his hands. "Cancel all my meetings for today." He needed time to think. NASA had given him 48 hours to decide. The project would mean leaving his position as the head of aircraft design at KSRI. It would mean moving to America for at least 2 years. His daughter would have to change schools, and his wife would have to leave her job as a professor. Jin-Ho walked to the institute's roof, where he often went to clear his mind. The spring air was cool, and cherry blossoms filled the trees below. He took out his tablet and opened the NASA proposal again. The challenge seemed impossible. Building a helicopter to fly in Mars' atmosphere was like trying to fly on Earth at 3 times the height of Mount Everest. The air would be 99% thinner than what helicopters usually flew in. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his wife. "Sun-Hai, did something exciting happen?" "Young Mai said you canceled all your meetings." Jin-Ho smiled. His wife always knew when something was up. He called her instead of texting back. "They want me to build a Mars helicopter," he said without greeting. There was a long pause on the other end. "NASA? Son?" he asked. "Yes." "And you're worried about us," she said. It wasn't a question. Jin-Ho watched a flock of birds fly past the building. It would change everything. Min-ji would have to leave her friends, and you'd have to give up your research position. "Jin-Ho," Sun-Hee's voice was firm. "Remember when we were in college, and you showed me your design for a rescue helicopter? You said someday you would build something that would change the world. Maybe this is that someday." His eyes fell on a newspaper on his desk. The headline read, "Korean Space Program Faces Budget Cuts." The article mentioned how many young engineers were leaving the field because of lack of opportunities. That evening, Jin-Ho sat with his 12-year-old daughter, Min-ji, at their kitchen table. He had spread out pictures of Mars and helicopters, trying to explain the project. "So," Min-ji said, pushing her glasses up her nose, "you would build the first flying machine for another planet." "That's right. But we would have to move to America. You'd have to change schools." Min-ji was quiet for a moment, looking at a picture of the red planet. Then she grinned. "Will I get to tell my new classmates that my dad builds Mars helicopters?" Jin-Ho laughed for the first time that day. "Yes, you would." Later that night, after Min-ji had gone to bed, Jin-Ho sat at his computer. The empty reply email to NASA stared back at him. He thought about all the young engineers who had given up on their dreams. He thought about Min-ji's smile when she talked about Mars helicopters. He thought about Sun-Hee's words about changing the world. His fingers moved across the keyboard. "Dear Dr. Wilson, I would be honored to join the Mars helicopter project. Best regards, Dr. Jin-Ho Park." As he pressed send, Jin-Ho felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would start planning the biggest move of his life. But tonight, he just sat back and looked at the stars through his window, wondering which small bright dot was Mars, waiting for humanity's first powered flight on another world. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly before Jin-Ho as he drove toward the NASA testing facility. The morning sun made the sand glow orange, reminding him of the Mars photos he had studied. After 3 months in America, this was his first day at the project site. The security guard checked his badge twice before letting him through. Not every day we get someone from Korea working on Mars projects, the guard said with a friendly smile. Inside the main building, Jin-ho found a group of engineers gathered around a table. A woman in a blue NASA jacket was pointing at some drawings. "Dr. Park, welcome." The woman turned and extended her hand. "I'm Dr. My-sun Lee, head of aerodynamics. I heard a lot about your work with high-altitude helicopters." Jin-ho was surprised to hear Korean accented English. Another Korean on the team. "Two of us, actually," a voice called from behind. A tall man walked up, carrying a laptop. Han-gil Kim, systems engineer. "Looks like NASA wanted the best helicopter minds from Korea." The team spent the morning reviewing their biggest challenge, making a helicopter fly in Mars' thin atmosphere. My-sun spread out her calculations on the table. "Our blades will need to spin 5 times faster than Earth helicopters," she explained, drawing quick diagrams. "But we have to keep the weight under 4 pounds. Jin-ho frowned at the numbers. "How can we make it strong enough?" "Carbon fiber," Han-gil said, opening a case. Inside was a rotor blade, black and shiny. Stronger than steel, but lighter than paper. They worked through lunch, testing different blade designs in the facility's wind tunnel. The first tests failed completely. The blades bent too much, making the helicopter shake. "Maybe we should try a different shape," My-sun suggested, after the 4th failed test. Her face showed tiredness, but her eyes were still eager. Jin-ho remembered something from his old rescue helicopter days. "What if we twist the blade tips? Like this?" He sketched quickly on a napkin. Han-gil's eyes lit up. "That could work. It would give us more lift without adding weight." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of tests and adjustments. The team worked long hours, often staying past midnight. They started keeping sleeping bags in the office. Min-ji sent Jin-ho pictures of her new American school, but he barely had time to look at them. One evening, as they watched another test, My-sun shared her story. "I almost quit engineering after my daughter was born," she said. "It seemed impossible to balance everything. But then I thought, how can I tell her to follow her dreams if I give up on mine?" Han-gil nodded. "My parents wanted me to take over their restaurant, but I couldn't stop thinking about space, about making something fly where nothing has flown before." Their breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning. The test helicopter lifted smoothly in the thin air chamber, hovering steadily. The whole team cheered. "It works," Han-gil shouted, hugging everyone. But Jin-ho noticed something wrong. The battery was draining too fast. On Mars, they would have only one chance to get it right. A failed first flight would mean the end of the mission. "We need to make it lighter," he said. "Every gram counts." They spent another month rebuilding parts, shaving off tiny amounts of weight wherever they could. My-sun redesigned the solar panels 3 times. Han-gil wrote new software to make the motors more efficient. Finally, after countless tests, they had their Mars helicopter. It looked delicate, like a large dragonfly. But in the test chamber, it flew perfectly. "Think about it," My-sun said as they watched it hover. "This little machine will be the first to fly on another planet. We're making history." Jin-ho thought about all the failed tests, the long nights, the time away from family. Then he looked at their helicopter, floating gracefully in the chamber. Sometimes the biggest dreams required the biggest sacrifices. "We're not just making history," he said. "We're opening the sky on Mars." 2 days before the scheduled launch, the Kennedy Space Center buzzed with activity. Engineers moved quickly between buildings, checking and rechecking every system. The Perseverance rover sat ready on the launch pad, with Ingenuity safely tucked beneath it. Jin-ho stood in the control room, reviewing the final checklist. The past week had been nothing but safety checks and system verifications. His eyes felt heavy from lack of sleep, but there was no time to rest. My-sun entered the room, carrying several tablets. "The weather forecast looks good for launch day," she said, handing Jin-ho one of the devices. "Clear skies and calm winds." "Perfect," Jin-ho replied, but something in my son's expression made him pause. "What's wrong?" Before she could answer, a young engineer burst into the room. Dae-jung Choi was the newest member of their team, fresh from university in Seoul. His face was pale. "Dr. Park, Dr. Lee, we have a problem," Dae-jung said, his hand shaking slightly as he opened his laptop. "I was running one final simulation of the deployment sequence, and I found something." The three gathered around the screen. Dae-jung pointed to a line of code in the helicopter's control system. Han-gil joined them, frowning at the numbers. "If the temperature drops below a certain point during the flight to Mars," Dae-jung explained, "this could cause the deployment system to activate early. The helicopter would try to unfold while still attached to the rover." Silence fell over the room. An early deployment would destroy both Ingenuity and possibly damage Perseverance. 7 months of work would be lost before they even reached Mars. "How did we miss this?" Han-gil asked, scrolling through the code. "The error only shows up under very specific conditions," Dae-jung said. "It would need a solar radiation spike combined with extreme cold. The chances are small, but we can't take that risk," Jin-ho finished. He looked at the clock. They had 36 hours until launch. The team quickly set up in one of the empty conference rooms. My son called NASA's software experts, while Han-gil and Dae-jung began working on a fix. Jin-ho contacted the launch director to warn them of a possible delay. Hours passed. Coffee cups piled up on the table, the room filled with technical drawings and hastily written equations. Outside, television crews were already setting up for the launch coverage. At midnight, Dae-jung jumped up from his computer. "I think I have it," he exclaimed. "If we add a temperature check before any deployment sequence, the system will lock until conditions are safe." The team spent the next 6 hours testing the fix. They ran hundreds of simulations, trying every possible combination of conditions that could occur during the flight to Mars. Finally, at dawn, Han-gil looked up from his screen. "It works," he said simply. "The system is secure." Jin-ho called the launch director with the news. They would make the launch window after all. As the team packed up their equipment, my son put a hand on Dae-jung's shoulder. "Good catch," she said. "You may have saved the entire mission." The young engineer blushed. "I was just doing my job." On launch day, the team stood together watching the massive rocket on the pad. The morning sun made it glow like a tall, white beacon. In less than an hour, it would carry their hopes and dreams toward Mars. "I keep thinking about that first test flight in the desert," Han-gil said quietly. "Remember how many times we failed before we got it right?" Jin-ho nodded. "Each failure taught us something, including this last one." The countdown began. As the numbers descended, Jin-ho thought about all the people who had worked to make this moment possible. Engineers, scientists, technicians, each one playing their part in humanity's greatest adventure. The rocket engines ignited, filling the air with thunder. As it rose into the blue Florida sky, Jin-ho whispered, "Safe journey, little one. See you on Mars." The first month after the launch passed slowly. The team returned to their regular lives, but their thoughts remained with the small helicopter traveling through space. My son Lee sat in her home office, looking at the latest tracking data from the spacecraft. Her daughter, Jae-yun, walked in carrying 2 cups of tea. "Is it still on course, Mom?" she asked, setting 1 cup on the desk. My son nodded, pointing to the screen. "See this line? That's where Perseverance is carrying Ingenuity through space. Everything is perfect so far." Jae-yun studied the screen carefully. 7 months seems like a long time to wait." "It is," my son agreed. "But sometimes the biggest achievements require the longest patience." At the testing facility, Han-gil spent his days running more simulations. Even though Ingenuity was already on its way to Mars, he couldn't stop thinking about ways to improve the control systems. The room that once buzzed with activity now felt strangely empty. One evening, as he worked late, Jin-ho found him surrounded by new drawings and calculations. Still trying to make it better? Jin-Ho asked, pulling up a chair. Han-Gil pushed his glasses up. I keep thinking about the temperature issue Dae-jung found. What if there are other problems we haven't discovered yet? Jin-Ho understood the worry. Every day, he checked the mission data multiple times, looking for any sign of trouble. The spacecraft was healthy, but the real challenges would begin on Mars. 3 months into the journey, the team gathered for their weekly meeting. Dae-jung connected from Seoul, where he had returned to finish his doctoral studies. The young engineer had become something of a celebrity in Korea's science community after finding the launch day problem. The solar panels are working at 98% efficiency, Dae-jung reported. Better than we expected in deep space. But it wasn't all good news. My son shared concerns about dust storms on Mars. Recent telescope data showed increasing storm activity near their landing site. If the conditions were too harsh, Ingenuity might never get a chance to fly. The 5th month brought personal challenges. Jin-Ho's daughter, Minji, was struggling in her new American school. During a video call, she asked when they would return to Korea. I miss my old friends, she said. And the food here is different. Jin-Ho felt torn between his family's needs and the mission. That night, he called my son for advice. I understand, my son said. Jae-yun barely spoke to me for a month after her father and I divorced. I thought I was losing her. But then she saw me working on Ingenuity, saw how much it meant. Now she wants to be an engineer too. In the 6th month, Han-Gil made a breakthrough. He developed a new software update that could help Ingenuity handle stronger winds. The team spent weeks testing it, preparing to upload it once they reached Mars. The final month was the hardest. Every day brought them closer to the landing, and the tension grew. They all knew the statistics. Only about half of all Mars missions succeeded. One small problem could end everything. One evening, the team met for dinner at my son's house. Jae-yun had decorated the living room with Mars posters and paper helicopters. Han-Gil brought Korean food he had cooked himself, remembering Minji's comments about missing home. As they sat together, sharing memories of the past months, Jin-Ho realized something important. This mission had given them more than just a chance to make history. It had made them a family. To Ingenuity, my son raised her glass, and to the people who made it fly. They all knew the biggest challenge still lay ahead. But whatever happened on Mars, they would face it together. The NASA control room was completely silent. After 7 months of waiting, the moment of truth had arrived. Perseverance, carrying Ingenuity, was about to enter the Martian atmosphere. The next 7 minutes would determine the fate of their mission. Jin-Ho sat between my son and Han-Gil, their eyes fixed on the main screen. Dae-jung watched through a video link from Korea, where it was already past midnight. The young engineer had dark circles under his eyes, but he refused to miss this moment. Entering Mars' atmosphere, a controller announced. The room tensed as the spacecraft began its descent. My son gripped the edge of her desk. These were the famous 7 minutes of terror, the time when the spacecraft had to slow down from 12,000 miles per hour to a gentle landing speed. Everything had to work perfectly, and they would not know what was happening until it was all over. The main screen showed a computer animation of the descent stages. First, the heat shield protected the spacecraft as it pushed through the thin Martian air. Then, at just the right moment, a huge parachute opened to slow their descent. Parachute deployed. The controller's voice was steady. All readings normal. Han-Gil whispered something in Korean, a prayer or maybe just words of hope. Jin-Ho noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he typed notes on his tablet. The next phase was the most dangerous. The spacecraft had to find a safe landing spot using its cameras and computer brain. If it chose wrong, both Perseverance and Ingenuity could be destroyed. Beginning final descent, the controller said. Sky crane deploying. This was the part that seemed impossible when Jin-Ho first learned about it. The rover would be lowered to the surface by cables, like a crane lifting a heavy box. except this crane was flying on another planet. Seconds felt like hours. The animation showed the rover getting closer and closer to the surface. Jin-Ho thought about all the work, all the long nights, all the problems they had solved to get here. Would it be enough? Suddenly, a new voice broke the silence. Touchdown confirmed. The room erupted in cheers. People hugged and jumped with joy. My son wiped tears from her eyes, while Han Gil pumped his fists in the air. On the video screen, Dad Jung was dancing around his office. But Jin-Ho knew their work wasn't finished. They still needed to check if Ingenuity had survived the journey. The helicopter was safely tucked under the rover, but 7 months in space could damage even the best-built machine. The first images from Mars arrived an hour later. The rover's cameras showed the landing site, a flat, red plain with small rocks scattered around. The sky was a pale orange, and in the distance, they could see the rim of an ancient crater. Checking Ingenuity's systems now, Han Gil announced, his fingers flying over the keyboard. One by one, green lights appeared on his screen as each system responded. Power systems online. Computer responding. Temperature normal. All sensors functional. Finally, Han Gil turned to the team with a huge smile. Ingenuity is perfect. She's ready. My son reached for her phone to call her daughter. Dae-jung was already talking excitedly to his professors in Seoul. The control room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Jin-Ho sat quietly, looking at the Mars images. Somewhere in those pictures, attached to the belly of Perseverance, was their little helicopter. Soon, it would attempt something no machine had ever done before: fly in the alien skies of another world. "Welcome to Mars," he whispered. "Now comes the hard part." 3 weeks after landing, the team prepared for Ingenuity's first test. The rover had moved to a flat area that would serve as the first helicopter airport on Mars. Jin-Ho studied the images from the site, checking every rock and bump in the terrain. Soo Jin-yoon, their flight dynamics specialist, walked into the control room carrying several data printouts. She had joined the team 6 months ago, fresh from the Korean Air Force. Her experience with high-altitude aircraft made her perfect for this mission. "The wind readings are higher than we expected," Soo Jin said, spreading the papers on the table. "The atmosphere is also colder than our original calculations." My son frowned at the numbers. "These conditions are outside our test parameters. Maybe we should wait for better weather." But waiting had its own risks. The helicopter was designed to last only 30 days on Mars. Each day they delayed meant one less chance to achieve their goal. Han Gil joined them, bringing more data from the rover's weather station. "The wind speed is increasing. If this is a seasonal pattern, we might not get a better chance." Soo Jin stood quietly, looking at the data. Then she spoke. "I have an idea, but it's not in the original flight plan." The room fell silent. Changing the flight plan now was risky. They had tested everything hundreds of times on Earth. Any change could lead to failure. "What's your idea?" Jin-Ho asked. Soo Jin pointed to her calculations. "If we increase the rotor speed by 12% and adjust the blade angle, we can handle these winds. I've run the numbers 3 times." The team studied her proposal. The changes would use more battery power, giving them less flight time. But Soo Jin's calculations showed it could work. "It's risky," my son said. "We've never tested the rotors at that speed." "On Earth." "No," Soo Jin agreed. "But Mars is different. The thin air actually makes it easier on the motors. They can handle the extra speed." Jin-Ho remembered something from their early tests. The helicopter had always performed better than their calculations predicted. Maybe Soo Jin was right. Maybe Mars would be more forgiving than they thought. They spent the next 2 days testing Soo Jin's ideas in simulations. Dae-jung joined remotely from Korea, checking the software changes. Every test showed the same result. It could work. Finally, it was time to decide. The team gathered in the main control room. The screen showed the latest images from Mars. Ingenuity sitting alone on the red soil, its solar panel glinting in the weak sunlight. "We have one chance to make history," Jin-Ho said. "If we're going to try something new, this is the time." My son nodded slowly. "Soo-jin's math is solid. I say we try." Han-Gil agreed. The helicopter was built to push boundaries. "Let's push one more." They worked through the night, preparing the new flight commands. Soo-jin checked every number 3 times. There could be no mistakes. As the sun rose over California, the team sent their commands to Mars. Now they had to wait. It would take several hours for the signal to reach Mars and for Ingenuity to prepare for its historic attempt. "Whatever happens," Soo-jin said quietly, "we gave it our best shot." Jin-Ho looked at his team. My son's quiet confidence, Han-Gil's nervous energy, Soo-jin's determined focus. Together, they had built something that no one thought possible. Now they would find out if it could really fly. Dawn broke over the Martian landscape. Ingenuity stood alone on the red soil, its rotors motionless, waiting for the commands from Earth. Inside NASA's control room, the team watched their screens intently. In a few minutes, they would attempt the first powered flight on another planet. "All systems are ready," Han-Gil announced, his voice steady despite the tension. "Battery at full charge. Motors responding normally." My son monitored the weather data from Mars. Wind speed is within acceptable limits. Temperature at -63 degrees Celsius. Soo-jin sat beside Jin-Ho, double-checking her modified flight parameters one last time. The young engineer's face showed no sign of the doubt she must have felt about her bold changes to the original plan. "Sending activation sequence now," Jin-Ho said. His finger pressed the command key, and the signal began its journey to Mars. The room fell silent. Now they could only wait. The minutes passed slowly. Dae-jung watched from Korea through the video link, where a crowd of students and professors had gathered despite the late hour. News cameras around the world pointed at the NASA building, waiting to broadcast humanity's first attempt at flight on another world. Suddenly, the first data began arriving from Mars. Ingenuity receiving commands, Han-Gil reported. Rotors beginning warm-up sequence. More information flowed in. The helicopter's computer was running through its pre-flight checks. Each green light on the screen brought them closer to the moment of truth. Rotor speed increasing, my son said. Approaching takeoff velocity. Soo-jin held her breath. This was where they would see if her calculations were correct. If the rotors spun too fast, they could tear themselves apart. If too slow, the helicopter would never leave the ground. The main screen showed the data they had all been waiting for. "Liftoff confirmed," Han-Gil shouted. "We have flight." The control room erupted in cheers, but the team remained focused on their screens. Ingenuity was hovering 3 meters above the Martian surface, exactly as planned. Soo-jin's modifications were working perfectly. 30 seconds of flight time. My son counted. Stability perfect. All systems normal. In Korea, the crowd watching with Dae-jung began singing. Around the world, people watched in amazement as the first images arrived from Mars, showing Ingenuity's shadow on the red planet's surface. After a full minute, the helicopter began its descent. It landed softly on the same spot it had taken off from, settling gently onto the Martian soil. "Flight complete," Jin-Ho announced. "Landing confirmed." The celebration that followed was unlike anything NASA had seen before. Engineers hugged and cried. Phone calls and messages poured in from space agencies around the world. In the Korean Space Research Institute, they hung a large banner, "Korea helps Mars take flight." Later that evening, as the team gathered in a quiet conference room, they looked at the first complete video of the flight. There was their helicopter, a tiny machine on a vast red plain, doing what nothing had ever done before. "We actually did it," Soo-jin whispered. "We flew on Mars." My son smiled at the young engineer. "Your calculations made it possible. Sometimes the boldest ideas are the best ones." Jin-Ho looked at his team with pride. They had faced every challenge, solved every problem. And now they had written their names in the history books. But more than that, they had shown what people could achieve when they dared to dream big. "This isn't just a victory for us," he said. "This is a victory for everyone who ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was possible." 1 year after Ingenuity's historic first flight, Jin-Ho Park stood at the podium in Seoul National University's main auditorium. The room was filled with young engineering students, their faces eager and attentive. Behind him, a large screen showed Ingenuity's latest images from Mars. "Our little helicopter has now completed 50 flights," Jin-Ho told the audience. "That's 49 more than we originally planned." Sometimes the greatest achievements come from exceeding our own expectations. The helicopter had become far more than a technology demonstration. It now served as the rover's aerial scout, flying ahead to find safe paths and interesting research sites. Each flight pushed the boundaries of what they thought possible on Mars. In the front row, my son sat with her daughter Jae-yun, who was now a first-year aerospace engineering student. Next to them, Han-gil watched proudly as his new Mars helicopter design rotated on the screen, a larger, more capable machine that would go to Mars in 3 years. After the lecture, Jin-Ho met with the Korean Space Agency's directors. They had an important proposal for him. Korea was planning its first Mars mission, and they wanted him to lead it. "We want to build on Ingenuity's success," the director explained. "Show the world that Korea is ready for deep space exploration." That evening, Jin-Ho called Soo-jin, who was now working at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. Her bold thinking during Ingenuity's first flight had earned her a permanent position there. "They want me to lead Korea's Mars program," he told her. "You'll say yes, of course," Soo-jin replied. "Think of all the young engineers who need someone to show them the way, just like you did for me." Meanwhile, in a high school classroom in Busan, Da-jung was speaking to a group of students. He had turned down offers from big technology companies to become a teacher, wanting to inspire the next generation of engineers. The students gathered around a small replica of Ingenuity that Da-jung had built. "Who wants to learn how to make a Mars helicopter?" he asked. Every hand in the room shot up. At her university laboratory, my son worked with a team of graduate students, developing new materials for future Mars aircraft. The lessons they had learned from Ingenuity were leading to amazing innovations. "The hardest part wasn't making it fly," she told her students. "It was believing it could fly. Once we believed, we found a way." One weekend, the original team gathered at Han-gil's house for dinner. His living room wall displayed their group photo from the first flight day, next to a picture of Ingenuity on Mars. "Did you see the latest space agency announcement?" Han-gil asked as they ate. "They're planning helicopter missions to Venus and Titan. We started something big." Jin-Ho looked around the table at his friends. My son was showing Jae-yun her new aircraft designs. Soo-jin was discussing satellite communications with Da-jung. Their achievements had opened doors not just for themselves, but for an entire generation. Later, as they watched the sunset, Jin-Ho thought about that first day in his office in Seoul when a phone call from NASA changed his life. He remembered all the doubts, the challenges, and the moments of triumph. "We didn't just make history," he said to his friends. "We made the future." Above them, Mars shone as a bright red dot in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, their little helicopter waited for its next flight, a symbol of what humans could achieve when they dared to dream and work together to make those dreams real.